Pardon?
Are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Great. Good afternoon, and welcome to another lecture sponsored by the Calvin Academy of Lifelong Learning. The Calvin Academy of Lifelong Learning, or CALL as we like to call it, is a member-based lifelong learning community. CALL has no age limits and offers a wide variety of courses, bonus lectures like this one, events, social groups, and other travel opportunities. We're grateful that you're joining us here today for this lecture, either in person or virtually. My name is Michael Wiltskett. I'm the Associate Director for Alumni Engagement here at Calvin University, and I also have the privilege of serving on the CALL board. Today, we are fortunate to spend time with Professor Will Katerberg and hear his talk titled Immigration Debates in America. Professor Katerberg is a professor of history and director of the program in Western American Studies here at Calvin University. He's also the curator of Heritage Hall, the archives of Calvin University, and the director of the Melima program in Western American Studies. In addition, he is the editor of Origins, the magazine published by Heritage Hall. We're thankful for the opportunity to learn from him today, and following the talk, we'll have some time for your questions. Now please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Will Katerberg.
Just in case. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This is the first time I've been in a room with people unmasked at Calvin for a couple of years. It's a little bit strange. Thank you for your introduction, Michael, and thanks to the CALL program for inviting me to do this. As you can see from the title slide of my presentation, the topic and the title are related to a book I published a couple of years ago. I think it was late 2020 when it came out, on immigration debates. That was the product of a seminar I was involved in of Calvin alumni and Calvin University and seminary faculty looking at issues related to immigration and refugees. One of the things we were asked to do was to think about how we could contribute to the conversation after the seminars that we had were over, and I ended up writing this book as my contribution. So the lecture today includes a lot of material directly pilfered from the book, and then some material summarized in the book. The United States has long been a country of immigrants. Indeed, except for those of Native American ancestry, every U.S. citizen today traces her or his story to an immigrant. For just as long, there have been debates over immigration. The goal of my lecture today is to step back a little bit and look at those debates. We will focus on 5 moments of debate about immigration. When we look at these debates, we can see ourselves in a distant mirror of sorts. We can learn something about ourselves as we examine our ancestors and their values. And we can think a little bit about what those values call us to think or do today. So consider this story. In 1835, Samuel Morse, a painter and tinkerer who soon would invent the telegraph and Morse code, feared that thousands of unfit people were pouring into his country every day. He wrote a book called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States to Alert Americans to the Danger. Quote, "Our institutions are at the mercy of a body of foreigners. We are the dupes of our own hospitality," unquote. Some applauded him, others were appalled. When he ran for the mayor of New York City, he came in 4th of 4, receiving fewer than 1,500 votes. But his fears about immigrants were common during this period. Morse spoke aloud the sentiments of many other Americans. He worried that these foreigners threatened American freedom. He thought that they would not and could not adopt American ways. Not all of them were dangerous, he allowed, but enough were that we must suspect them all. The government should bar them from coming to America. Who were these terrible and unfit immigrants feared by Morse? They were German Roman Catholics. Like many other native-born Protestant American at the times, Morse also worried about Irish Catholics. Fear of Catholic immigrants in the 1830s turned American politics upside down. Anti-Catholics spread stories about conspiracies in Roman Catholic convents and schools. Their claims sometimes inspired violence. In 1834, for example, a mob burned down a convent in Massachusetts, destroying Bibles and musical instruments. As others in the mob stole communion wafers, they joked, "Now I have God's body in my pocket." Historians call this kind of anti-immigration sentiment nativism. They mean campaigns by native-born Americans to keep the wrong kinds of immigrants, in their view, from coming to the United States. Morse ran for mayor of New York on a nativist platform. In his day, the unwanted immigrants were Roman Catholic and Irish and German. Acceptable immigrants were Protestant, from their point of view, and from Britain and Northwestern Europe. For nativists, democracy depended on attracting the right kind of immigrants, assimilating them to American life, and keeping out the wrong kinds. Debates about immigration have shaped American politics from its origins. These debates are closely tied to two types of nationalism that scholars call cultural or ethnocultural, so ethnic combined with the word cultural, ethnocultural, or civic. Now, these are ideal types. Some people fit them closely. Many people fall somewhere in between the two types. Nativists, like Morse, have promoted an ethnocultural vision of America. Ethnicity, race, culture, and religion are essential to the nation and citizenship from this viewpoint, not just political values like freedom and rule of law. Until World War II, perhaps even later, this viewpoint generally meant that real Americans were white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. Anglo-Saxon here referring to people from not just the British Isles, but Northwestern Europe. And the British Isles here does not include, of course, people who are Irish. In this vision, you're born into a nation. You don't choose to be white or English or Swedish or Scottish. You don't choose to be Irish, German, or Chinese. You're born into one of these groups. Religious tradition, ethnic and racial background, and political values come as a package in this ethnocultural vision of citizenship and nation. Protestants in countries like England or the Netherlands established the values of freedom and habits of self-government. These things are inseparable. Democratic government is incompatible with being Roman Catholic, where you must bow to the Pope's authority. And people from the wrong kinds of ethnic and racial groups are morally corrupt, biologically unfit, and not ready for freedom. They might be able to evolve and in small numbers assimilate to American life, but nativists were skeptical. Americans today generally view ethnicity and race as distinct categories. Ethnicity is about cultural heritage, such as Korean culture, French culture, English, Japanese, etc. Race usually focuses on outward appearance, especially skin color. In the 1800s and early 1900s, people often referred to ethnic groups like the Irish as races. They ranked races from more advanced to primitive and degraded, whites above blacks, and English and Swedish above Irish, Italian, and Jewish. Crucially, politics, religion, and biology could not be separated. Defenders of immigration typically have promoted a more civic vision of the nation. They have often been pragmatic about immigration, emphasizing the need for immigrants as laborers in a growing economy. In the civic vision, being loyal to the United States and loving liberty and democracy is enough to make you an American. A person's race or religion doesn't matter. You do not need to be born into a civic nation to be a citizen. It is something you can choose, whether you are native-born or an immigrant. The values and habits of freedom are not tied to specific racial, ethnic, or religious backgrounds. Self-government may have first emerged in places like England, but it's not inherently Protestant or English or Dutch or what have you. Catholics, Muslims, Buddhists, and atheists can be loyal Americans too, and no ethnic group or racial group is unfit for self-government. Immigrants can adapt to American life, and they should be welcome. A Roman Catholic archbishop from Minnesota, John Ireland, expressed this vision in 1903. Quote, "The vital principle of democracy must ever animate the republic. Every man must be equal before the law with every other man in civil and political rights. It matters not what his place of birth, his religious creed, his race or color. If he is an American citizen, the laws of the land must shield him, the favors of the land must flow upon him," unquote. Ireland was Roman Catholic and an immigrant. His family had fled famine in Ireland in 1848. He was a man of his time, indeed, in being hesitant to support the rights of women to vote and hold office, but he was forthright about rejecting ethnicity, race, and religious background as essential to American liberty and citizenship. He defended the rights of African Americans. He urged immigrants to embrace American life, and he insisted that being Roman Catholic was no bar to being a loyal American. So just a very brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today, the history. That's sort of a conceptual introduction to what we're going to look at today. Today I want to give you an overview of history of debates over immigration policy in the United States. We'll start in the 1830s to 1850s with opposition to Catholic immigration. Second, we'll look at anti-Chinese campaigns from the 1850s to the 1920s. Third, we'll examine policy related to immigrants from Europe and national origins quotas. Fourth, we'll look briefly into the history of U.S.-Mexican borderland region, the U.S.-Mexican borderland region, and immigration from Mexico and Central America. And finally, we'll look at debates related to Muslim immigration today. And I'll finish today with a few lessons that I think the history offers. So, Catholic immigrants. The picture that you see there is an African-American man and an Irish man sitting in a scale, and they're equally balanced. And what you can notice about it is that both are depicted as animal-like. The cartoon is meant to show the two dangers to democracy: African Americans voting and Irish people voting. So it's a way of showing how race was applied to European immigrants. So a few things about Catholic immigrants then. Nativism from the 1830s to the 1850s focused on Roman Catholic immigrants, Irish and German, for example. I'm going to talk mostly about Irish Catholic immigrants. So first of all, some numbers. Between 1820 and 1860, some 4.8 million people immigrated from Britain and Europe to the United States. That included about 1.5 million German and 1.9 million Irish newcomers. Besides mass immigration, this was an era of social change in other ways: industrialization, urbanization, dramatic frontier expansion as the United States took more and more control over the entire continent. Anxiety about all of this social and economic change helps explain anti-immigrant sentiment. When many things are changing, immigrants were an easy target. Quote, "Popery is a political system, despotic in its organization, anti-democratic and anti-republican, and cannot therefore exist with American republicanism," unquote. That's Samuel Morse again in 1835. So what did people like him mean when they said these things about Catholics? Anti-Catholics claimed that the Roman Catholic Church was not a true church and religion. They argued it was a foreign political power. They believed that Catholics obeyed their leaders like slaves. Catholics were loyal to a foreign power, their church, and could not be loyal to the United States. The church opposed freedom and democracy. Catholics would vote as the church commanded them as a bloc. Catholics thus would control American politics and subvert American democracy. They were unworthy of freedom and could not be trusted with American citizenship. Anti-Catholic sentiment like this had deep roots. Protestants often said that the Pope was the Antichrist and that the Roman Catholic Church was the tool of the devil. They remembered centuries of religious wars between Protestant and Roman Catholic nations and remembered martyrs killed by the Church. Catholics, of course, had their own memories of martyrs killed by Protestant rulers. Many Americans believed, Protestant Americans especially, that God had called the United States to be a beacon of Christian freedom and democracy. The Romish superstitions of Catholic immigrants threatened American freedom, threatened true Christianity, and the growth of the kingdom of God in the United States. Now, such sentiments weren't marginal. They could be found among the founders of the new nation, notably John Adams, its second president. His successor, Thomas Jefferson, rejected such view, defending the freedoms not just of Catholics, but of Jews and Muslims too. Now, there were half-truths in what anti-Catholics said. Some Catholics in America and Europe dismissed Protestant Christianity as the work of the devil. They insisted that salvation only came through Rome. Popes often criticized democracy during the 19th century. Catholic leaders viewed religious freedom as dangerous. How could true Christians support freedom of religion for heresy and faithlessness? What Protestants usually did not acknowledge was their own fear of religious freedom. They supported religious freedom for believers like themselves, but less so for others, such as Catholics and Jews. Baptists and Methodists had suffered persecution in Britain and its American colonies in the 1700s. Now they enjoyed freedom and influence, but were reluctant to support the same for new religious minorities. Opponents of immigration, for example, Irish Catholics, also viewed immigrants as morally and racially dangerous. One concern was their sheer number. The percentage of foreign-born people in the United States rose from under 2% in 1830 to over 13% in 1860. The Irish were fleeing poverty and a long history of oppressive British rule. Famine in 1845 led to an exodus from Ireland, with impoverished immigrants leaving Ireland for Britain, Canada, and the United States. So many left or died of starvation, malnutrition, and disease that the population of Ireland fell from 8.2 million in 1841 to 5.8 million in 1861. Most Irish came to the United States as single men and women. Most settled in American towns and cities looking for work. The men toiled in factories, dug canals, and worked the railroads. The women worked in factories too. They also served as maids and cooks in wealthy homes. Irish immigrants generally lived in the poorest neighborhoods, areas plagued by sewage, dirty water, and poorly ventilated buildings. They indeed did die of diseases like cholera and typhus, sometimes carrying these diseases from Ireland, sometimes catching them in North America. Nativists viewed these health issues as a sign of racial and moral weakness, overlooking how poverty and living conditions caused epidemics. They viewed the Irish as a lesser race, as this image suggests, as not really white, and often compared them to African Americans. The response was moral campaigns against the Catholic Church, against Irish immigrants, against poverty, against moral disorder. There was also a political response. The Whig Party, one of the major parties, the competitor of the Democratic Party, fell into decline in the 1830s and 40s and was replaced by a number of competing parties, among them the Native American Party, which was an explicitly anti-immigrant party. The new Republican Party that emerged in the 1850s picked up some of the pieces of the old Whig Party, but also pieces of the old Native American Party when it came into increasing influence in the northern states in the mid to late 1850s. The Republican Party was especially known for three things: promoting economic development, promoting anti-slavery, and promoting anti-immigrant sentiment. Fear of Irish immigrants declined in the late 19th century. By the 1890s, the Irish and Germans were old immigrants, familiar in the United States. Many had worked their way into the middle class and become influential in politics. They had proved their loyalty in the Civil War. The Democratic Party continued to win support from immigrants and from whites in the South, but some immigrants became Republicans, John Ireland among them. Still, the party more associated with anti-immigrant sentiment. Nativists had come to fear new immigrants, or nativists came to fear new immigrants after the Civil War from Eastern and Southern Europe: Poles, Jews, Italians, Russians, and Greeks, for example. Anti-Catholic sentiment would continue to come in waves in American politics and would continue to shape American politics well into the 20th century, for example. As late as 1960, when John Kennedy was running for president, he had to assure Protestant clergy that he would be in charge of his political views rather than the Pope. He was the first Catholic elected president. A notable turning point, but he still had to make the case against anti-Catholicism. All right, let's turn to Chinese immigrants. I'll start with an anecdote. Chung's son arrived in Los Angeles with $600 in 1871. He had dreams of starting a tea plantation. Mob violence and racist policies soon turned him bitter. A riot broke out in LA in October 1871. White workers hung, stabbed, and shot Chinese workers, killing 23. Police sent in to stop the violence encouraged it instead. Rioters beat Chung's son and robbed him. He survived only because he spoke just enough English to convince them not to kill him. The gold rush in California drew tens of thousands of Chinese in the 1850s, over 20,000 in 1852 alone. It also drew large numbers of people from Mexico, other parts of Latin America, large numbers from Canada, from Europe. Millions of Chinese also were migrating to other parts of South Asia during this era, as well as to Hawaii, Canada, and Australia. Chinese immigrants to the United States worked in mines, on the railroads, and in laundries, restaurants, stores, and hotels. Hundreds of Chinese women also came to the West, some taken from China by kidnappers, many sold into indentured servitude by their penniless families. They also worked in laundries, restaurants, and hotels. From the start, the Chinese inspired bitter opposition in California. Mexicans did as well, and Mexicans sometimes were lynched too, but by far the Chinese were the primary victims of this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment in California. The anti-immigrant, or specifically anti-Chinese sentiment, led to lynchings, pogroms when entire neighborhoods were cleared of Chinese immigrants and their businesses, and to regular labor violence, particularly in the railroad industry. It also led to efforts by the state legislature in California to either ban Chinese immigrants or impose harsh head taxes that would make it difficult for Chinese immigrants to afford to come into California. The courts repeatedly overturned this legislation, arguing that it was unconstitutional. But politicians there kept trying. White Americans during this period generally, not just in California, viewed the Chinese as racially degraded, immoral, dirty, lazy, diseased, drug addicted. White laborers hated Chinese for taking their jobs. European immigrants like the Irish, who suffered their own discrimination, were as hostile as native-born Americans. These European immigrants, like the Irish, after all, were aspiring to be fully white in their own way, and they hated the Chinese for getting in the way. A good example is the Working Men's Party of California, which was powerfully influential in the post-war decades. It was led by an Irish immigrant, Dennis Kearney. Kearney was not just politically organizing, he was perfectly happy to use violence as well. The United States itself, at the federal level, made discrimination against Chinese nationals policy in the 1870s and 1880s. In 1875, it excluded Chinese women as immigrants. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 suspended all immigration from China for 10 years. The United States renewed the policy in 1892 and made it permanent in 1902. These policies were the start not just of anti-Asian legislation, but also federal laws to regulate immigration generally. We'll pick up that story as we go. The United States had similar concerns about other Asian groups. They didn't view the Japanese negatively, but they were another race, and indeed, a lot of the opposition in their case was inspired by how successful they were. The Filipinos were another major concern for nativists in the 1920s. New laws, new immigration laws, sometimes targeted racial groups like the Chinese directly, as we've seen, but until the 1920s, mostly immigration law targeted them indirectly. For example, alien contract labor laws in the 1880s made it illegal for people to pay the transportation costs of an immigrant as part of a contract to work in the United States. Congress hoped the law would slow the flow of immigrants from Asia, but also from Southern, Eastern, and Central Europe. Nativists opposed these immigrants, all of them, on racial grounds. Native-born laborers opposed them often as well as cheap competition for jobs, believing that, quote, lower races, unquote, were willing to take lower wages and work in more degraded, dangerous work settings than white laborers would. In 1903, the United States excluded polygamists and political radicals as immigrants, and in 1907, it excluded unaccompanied children and people with physical or mental disabilities. Officials often enforce these laws selectively, however, depending on the health of the American economy and the race of the immigrants. In general, Asian and Pacific region immigration was banned in the United States in 1917 during the context of World War I. A reminder that it's not just bad economic conditions that often inspired nativism, kind of cooking it up again, but it was also wartime animus, wartime nationalism, sort of the nasty negative side of it. Filipinos were banned as immigrants in 1935. There's an interesting story. The Filipinos technically were not immigrants. They were considered American nationals because the Philippines, from the late 1890s into the 1940s, was an American-controlled colony, and so Filipinos and people from Puerto Rico and other American colonies had national status. They weren't citizens, but they could freely come to the United States. The fears of Filipinos, though, by the 1920s and 30s were so strong that in 1935, the United States negotiated an agreement with the Philippines. It promised to extend full independence to the Philippines eventually, and that would come indeed after World War II. And in return, the United States would no longer allow Filipinos to come to the United States as American nationals. It's also important to remember the larger context for anti-Asian immigration sentiment. This was an era when Native Americans were being forced onto reservations, a form of segregation. This was the Jim Crow era of segregation for African Americans in the South. This was also an era where there were efforts to suppress the freedom of Mexican Americans and beginning efforts to try and control the Mexican-American border. And it's important to recognize that the United States had a multiracial overseas empire during this period. So the immigration discrimination that we're describing here is part of a larger story of trying to create a racial order in the United States. All right, so let's turn back to European immigration. And I'll repeat a little bit some of what I've said about the evolution of American immigration policy and about the social context. So this will continue the story that we started with Irish and German Catholics, but look at how in that era, the 1830s to the 1850s, there was anti-immigration sentiment and immigration debates, but it didn't have a direct impact on national immigration policy. It's during the era from the 1880s to the 1920s that we would start to see immigration policy at the national level affect European immigrants, not just Chinese and other Asian immigrants. So remember the context. Mass immigration combined with industrialization, so a changing economy from primarily agricultural to, by the 1920s, the heart of the economy is industrial, and urbanization, millions of Americans moving to towns and cities. In 1860, the majority of Americans are rural. By the 1920s, the majority is urban. And let me emphasize again, there's a close relationship between anti-immigration sentiment and the economic cycle. Immigrants were more welcome in economic boom times, needed as laborers, and people were more confident then. Nativist hostility typically rose, got more virulent and more influential in bad economic times, and as I've indicated, during World War I. So there's a relationship between anxiety, economic anxiety, anxiety about social status, and nativism. This is also an era when there's a shift in where European immigration is coming from. Historians sometimes talk about the old immigration, by which they meant the British Isles and Northwestern Europe, so the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and so on, and then the new immigration from Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe, so think Italians and Greeks and Poles and Russians, Jews from Eastern Europe and Russia, and it was primarily not Protestant, but Roman Catholic, Jewish, and Eastern Orthodox. Let me give you some numbers again, too, to give you a sense of the scale. The scale of immigration is part of the story, too. In the 1850s, 2.5 million immigrants arrived. Roughly the same number, 2.5 million, came in the 1860s and 1870s. Now listen to the numbers. 5.2 million in the 1880s, 3.6 million in the 1890s. The economy goes down. 8.7 million in the 1900s, 5.7 million in the 1910s. that 5.7 million coming mostly between 1911 and 1914 when World War I started. The story here is a story of technology and globalization, the increasing movement of goods, of people and labor, aided by technology like steamships, railroads, and the telegraph. The steamship and railroads made travel cheaper, safer, and faster. It didn't cost a whole lot more to go from Italy to the United States than it did to go from Italy to France. And people often went back and forth. Okay. So in this context, native-born American Protestants wrestled with what to do. Some advocated harsh restriction policies. Others were more hopeful. The more hopeful appealed to the brotherhood of man. A minister named Howard Gross is an example. In a book called Aliens or Americans, published in 1906, he asked, quote, "Will we extend the hand of Christian brotherhood and helpfulness to the stranger within our gates?" Gross saw danger in immigrants who were different culturally and religiously, such as Italian Catholics or Russian Jews. The solution, he argued, was programs run by schools, charities, and churches to Americanize and Christianize immigrants. He believed that Catholic immigrants needed to be Christianized and Eastern Orthodox ones too. Immigration restriction also was necessary to make the flow of immigrants manageable enough to allow for assimilation. Quote, "The immigrant comes into a new environment, created alike by civil and religious liberty, and cannot escape its influence. Freedom is infectious and contagious, and the disease is speedily caught by the old world arrival." Unquote. Americanization and true Christianity, not Roman Catholicism, would teach immigrants the right kind of liberty, he hoped. Nonetheless, he opened his book with a poem called Unguarded Gates by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. The poem compared immigrants to wolves who threatened America's gates and to the Goths and Vandals who trampled Rome. A little bit about policy now. In a sense, there was no real federal immigration law until the 1880s. There were naturalization laws dating to the 1790s, which described processes and rules for immigrants becoming citizens. Note that non-white immigrants, by definition, could not become citizens, so Chinese immigrants could not become citizens. Their American-born children, though, were born as citizens. State laws allowed for the deportation of indigents, and states sometimes used those to deport unwanted Irish immigrants. The United States at the federal level began to build a recognizable immigration bureaucracy beginning in the 1880s. So in this context, the kind of national racial quotas we're talking about here, race here means not people of color versus whites, but French, German, Italian, Swedish, Dutch, as well as Japanese, Chinese, Jewish, etc. If you look at that drawing, the woman with the lamp presumably represents the United States, Enlightenment, and liberty, and the people you see ringed around her, it's a racial hierarchy, with, on the top right, people of European descent, and then increasingly people of the wrong kind of European descent, and as you go down, people of Middle Eastern descent, and then people of African and Asian and Pacific Island descent. So this was published, it's an image associated with a national exposition, I think the one in St. Louis around 1905, yep. Okay. Remember the key thing here. Cultural and social characteristics of ethnic groups were seen as rooted in the biology of race. People during this time who feared the wrong kind of immigrants talked about immigration as leading to race suicide. American policies were leading to race suicide. The Anglo-Saxon race, people from the British Isles, not the Irish, and from northwestern Europe, by allowing all these immigrants to come in, and these immigrants having large numbers of children during a period when native-born Americans of Protestant and Western European and British descent were having fewer children, they feared what they called race suicide. They promoted what they called eugenics, which was policies that were designed to weed out the wrong kind of people, prevent them from coming in the case of immigration, or use things like sterilization and so on to prevent the wrong kind of people from having children, and to promote policies that would encourage the right people to have children. During this period, policies evolved from more indirect to more direct efforts to make this happen. Indirect policies, as the cartoon suggests, included things like literacy tests, laws that prevented people with diseases or mental disabilities from coming in as immigrants, laws designed to prevent criminals or polygamists or political radicals from coming in. But again, remember, these are nice laws because they allow you to discriminate racially, because you can enforce them against the immigrants you don't like and be a little bit more open-handed with the ones that you do like. Much the same was true of laws in the American South, which were designed to prevent African Americans from voting, things like literacy tests, enforced against African Americans, not enforced against white Southerners. Policies shifted from the 1880s to the 1920s away from indirect and to national origins policies. These are quotas. In 1921, Congress passed and a president finally signed the Emergency Quota Act. The Emergency Quota Act used the census of 1910 to get the percentage of people from different national backgrounds in the United States, and then created quotas for new immigrants who could come in. And so, as you can imagine, the older British population or the older German immigrant population, or Dutch or Scandinavian, would be larger than the population of recent immigrant groups like Jews and Poles. It also limited, the 1921 Act, limited the total number of immigrants to 350,000. In 1924, the United States passed the National Origins Act. It confirmed the banning of all immigration from Asia and the Pacific region, and it tightened the immigration quotas. Instead of 1910, it used the census of 1890, where the older immigrants and the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant part of the population would be proportionally larger, and recent immigrants from places like Italy and Greece, Poland and Russia and so on would again be proportionally smaller, and it limited the total to 165,000. This went so far as in the 1930s to refusing to accept Jewish refugees, even children, and refusing to take them in even if they could come in under a national origins quota. Lest those of you who are from Canada think Canadians, are better. Canada did basically the same thing. A good example is a ship called the St. Louis, which arrived in 1939. The United States turned it away. Canada did the same thing. Eventually, the ship was forced to go back to Europe. Of the 288 of the people on the ship, 288 were taken in by Britain. The rest were taken in by other countries in Europe. Of the ones who ended up in Europe, 87 escaped, and the rest died during the Holocaust. Hundreds of thousands of Jews tried to flee Germany and Europe during this period. Countries in Central and South America took tens of thousands. Switzerland alone took over 30,000. Some 60,000 got to British-controlled Palestine. Tens of thousands went to China. Only after World War II ended did the United States give priority to displaced persons from Europe within its quota system. This allowed 13,000 displaced Jews to come to the United States. Now, it's not all a story of discrimination. It's important to recognize that there were countervailing ideas. One of those that was becoming common in the early 1900s was the idea of a melting pot. America as a melting pot where people from diverse ethnic backgrounds come, and the American experience, whether it's the experience of freedom or settling in the frontier wilderness, would turn old world people into Americans. So this was a somewhat more liberal or accepting view of immigrants. It still saw racial differences, but it was more accepting of immigrants because it believed, or it suggested, that immigrants would Americanize, lose their old world ways, become Americans, and melt into the American nation, or as it was sometimes phrased, the American race. A more radical vision was known as cultural pluralism. Cultural pluralism not only assumed racial differences or ethnic differences, but assumed they were good. And so cultural pluralists like Franz Boas, an anthropologist, and Randolph Bourne, a journalist, argued that what made the United States special, unique, and progressive was precisely its ethnic, its cultural, its racial diversity. So we do see countervailing ideas during this period. However, in the 1920s and 30s, those who promoted the more ethno-cultural, the more racial vision of America won the policy battles. Fighting World War II, the horror of the Nazi Holocaust would inspire a resurgence of the civic vision in the decades after World War II and reshape policy in the second half of the 20th century. So I'm running a little bit behind here, so I'll skip a little bit more quickly over the US-Mexico borderlands. Then I'll conclude with something about Muslim immigration and some general ideas about what we can learn from this history. The most important part of the story that I want to emphasize with immigration from Mexico and Central America is the long history. Before Europeans came, the borderland area that is now northern Mexico and the southwestern United States, as you can see from the map, from what is now Texas all the way to what is now California, that was always an area of exchange, of trade goods between indigenous communities, the flow of ideas, religious ideas, cultural traditions back and forth. Agriculture spread from Central America and Mexico into North America. American trade goods from what is now the United States flowed in the other direction as well, and people groups migrated. That continued after the Spanish arrived. The Spanish Empire, especially in its northern zones, and especially in what is now the United States, was a borderland region where native groups, relatively untouched by Spanish influence, encountered native groups and communities of Spanish settlers and mestizo, or mixed blood peoples. The same continued during the Mexican era, when much of that territory was, again, Mexican, but with this borderland quality between relatively independent Native American groups and then these more mixed communities, indigenous, mixed blood, and Mexicans of Spanish descent. The United States, when it conquered this territory and made it American in the late 1840s then, took over a borderland region with a long history of people and goods moving back and forth through the region. It's important to recognize, too, that the region was geographically, not just culturally, a single region. And so the America-Mexico border was really an artificial imposition on a region that had long been integrated. More than that, it remained integrated well into the 1960s. American businesses in the early 20th century, and especially in large numbers during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, recruited Mexican laborers to come in, sometimes seasonally, sometimes for longer periods. And then during periods of economic downturns, or when anti-Mexican sentiment rose up, they would get pushed out and deported back to Mexico. And American-born citizens often were pushed into Mexico with them. But that long history of, we might say, seeing Mexicans as a reserve army of labor. You could bring them in, recruiting them. There was actually a program in the 1930s and 40s, the Bracero program, that brought Mexican workers in. And then there were also, during the 1930s and 1950s, operations to remove Mexican Americans when they were viewed too many, and it's beginning to be a problem. But crucially, though, that borderland region was treated as a borderland region and recognized economic, labor, and people exchange across the border. It's worth noting, too, that in the 1920s, when those national origins laws were being written, Canada, Mexico, and the Americas were excluded from them. And so Canadians and Mexicans could still come in as laborers. Canadians, too, were viewed as a source of potential labor. They'd come in when needed, and when not needed, presumably the flow would slow. What changed in the 1960s is interesting. In 1952, the United States, so after World War II, passed a new immigration law. It ended discrimination against Asians, and Asians could now come in as immigrants because of this law. It slightly tweaked, in that sense, the national origins quotas, but it didn't end the quota system. It also started to allow for refugees to come in. The next major American policy passed related to immigration and naturalization came in 1965, amid all the civil rights movements, right? So now it's not just a reaction against the old quotas because of World War II and the Holocaust, but now growing civil rights movements for African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans. In that more pluralistic civil rights context, national immigration policy was written. The old quotas were gotten rid of. All nations now had a quota, but the quotas were no longer based on these racial grounds. So that opens up immigration, not just from Europe now, but from all over the world. Crucially, though, Canada, Mexico, and Latin America now get quotas too. So what opens up migration for the rest of the world actually closes down a century-long history of legal migration from Mexico. Well, the laws may have changed, but the flow of people didn't change. So more than 18 million people migrated legally to the United States between 1965 and 1995. Triple that number had come between 1935 and 1965. More significant than the growth of immigration after World War II was how it changed. Europe after World War II, after a few hard years, enjoyed an economic boom in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. So immigrants from Europe mostly stopped coming to the United States. The number of immigrants from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, however, grew dramatically. Also the number coming from Mexico and Latin America. Well, from Latin America at least. Another aid to this was family immigration provisions. So there were still officially quotas on the number of immigrants who could come, but there were exceptions for family members. So if I've successfully immigrated and naturalized, I could bring over my parents, for example. And that also helps to explain the growing numbers. So what did this mean for Mexican immigration and Latino immigration more broadly, especially Latino immigration from Central America through Mexico? The quotas for Mexico were too low to meet the demand for Mexican labor. So American employers wanted more laborers, immigrants from Mexico than the law allowed. The quotas for Mexico were also too low to meet pressure in Mexico. Economic problems, desire for economic opportunity, desire to escape political conflict that pushed Mexicans to migrate to the United States. As a result, the flow of Mexicans to the US did not change, but now many of them came illegally rather than legally. Between 1969 and 1980, the population of undocumented immigrants to the US grew from 500,000 to over 2 million. In 1990, it remained about 2 million, but 1.5 million illegal migrants from other countries added to it. By 2007, there were 6.9 million illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants from Mexico and 12.2 million in total. It's worth noting, though, that in the last decade, the number of undocumented or illegal immigrants has actually become negative. Again, reflecting these flows change not just with political policies, but also economic circumstances. Okay. My point, I guess, in this section is to emphasize the challenge of controlling the US-Mexico border region today reflects the long history and geography of the region. It has been a region that has always had the movement of people and goods, and the border has always been an unnatural kind of barrier, and it has never worked. Finally, a couple of comments on Muslim immigrants. I'll take an example. Bob Schooneyungen did not inspire this, but I think you'll like it. Italian Catholics, Dutch Calvinists, and other European immigrants made Paterson, New Jersey, a vibrant blue-collar city a century ago. Muslim immigrants are bringing new life to Paterson today. People refer to one Paterson neighborhood as Little Ramallah or Little Istanbul, not unlike Little Italy and Chinatown neighborhoods in the past. The neighborhood has halal butchers, Middle Eastern restaurants, signs in Arabic, and you can find similar kinds of enclaves in Brooklyn, Detroit, and Los Angeles. Paterson's Arab-American mayor is a devout Roman Catholic married to a Muslim. As with Catholic immigrants in the past, debates today about Muslim immigrants are fierce. Anti-Muslim hatred sometimes sparks vandalism against mosques and attacks on individual people, and sometimes on people who are deemed as looking Muslim, like Sikhs. I remember a former colleague at Calvin who's from Brazil saying that he was sometimes stopped and asked if he was Muslim when he arrived at the airport in the United States. Religious, racial, and ethnic differences often get tangled up, and some native-born Americans today fear that this new group of people is ill-suited for freedom. So let me say a little bit about that. The current waves of Muslims immigrating to the United States since the 1960s come from Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Immigrants from these parts of the world who are Christian, Hindu, or Sikh sometimes are confused with Muslims because of their skin color, accents, turbans, or headscarves. For example, attacks on Sikh Americans. Today, Muslims make up 1% of the American population of 330 million people. If current trends continue in 2050, Muslims will make up 2% of the US population of 438 million people. A majority of Americans have opposed accepting refugees since the 1970s. That's true whether they're Vietnamese, Cuban, or from the Middle East and Africa. What's interesting is how this divide falls, often along religious, racial, and party lines. 68% of evangelicals and 68% of Republicans say that the United States has no responsibility to accept refugees. By contrast, 65% of religiously unaffiliated people, 50% of Catholics believe that the United States does have this responsibility. White Americans split 48, no responsibility, to 46% responsibility. Healthy majorities of Black and Hispanic voters, 67 and 59%, emphasize responsibility. There's also a youth component to this. 61% of people 18 to 29 emphasize responsibility, compared to 48% of people over 65, with age groups in between at about half. People with postgraduate education, 71% say we have a responsibility. People with college degrees, 63% do. People with some college, 49%, and so on. The public is also divided along religious, racial, and partisan lines in their view of Muslims. 53% of Jews, 39% of Catholics, and 34% of non-religious people have favorable views of Muslims. 31% of mainline Protestants and 20% of white evangelicals do. Knowing a Muslim corresponds strongly with favorable views. Over 75% of Jews say they know a Muslim, and 61% of Catholics. Only 1% of white evangelicals do. Black Americans have more favorable views of Muslims than white Americans. Political affiliation is also a strong predictor. It's also interesting to hear a little bit about Muslim immigrant views of the United States. Immigrant and refugee Muslims have more favorable views of the United States than do native-born Muslim Americans. 1/3 of Muslims have favorable views of evangelicals. The favorable views of immigrant Muslims perhaps reflect greater security, opportunity, and freedom in the United States compared to where they came from before they arrived here. Second-generation Muslim Americans perhaps experience a gap between American ideals about freedom and equality and the treatment they receive as Muslims in the United States. All right, I'm going to quickly run through my conclusions. I'm just going to do a short version, and then we'll have some time for questions. One insight: immigration is part of the history of globalization. Barriers to movement of people broke down in the 19th century, things like steamships and the railroads, and no surprise, the story of American immigration is part of a global story of migration. In the long run, kingdoms, nations, and empires have been able to resist migration, but mostly unsuccessfully. A second insight is that anti-immigrant sentiment is connected to other issues of race and power. Opponents of immigration today don't always use overt racial language. There's a racial component to discrimination against Muslims, but it's usually couched in religious terms, for example. Let's see. Really trying to go. A third insight is patterns of conflict and adaptation. America is a nation of immigrants, but immigrants from one generation often have feared new immigrants a generation or two later. In the 1830s to 1850s, Irish Americans were the racial threat. Irish Americans soon viewed Chinese immigrants and then Jewish immigrants as the racial threats, and so on. The same is true of religion. Nativists like Samuel Morse insisted that Catholics hated freedom and could not be loyal Americans. Today, 5 of our 9 Supreme Court justices are Catholic. Catholics embrace democracy like other Americans do. They come from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds, often mixed through intermarriage. They disagree with each other about issues just as much as people with other religious backgrounds do. The same is true of Mormons, once a despised religious minority, now mainstream Americans. And not surprisingly, many Catholics now view Muslims as a religious threat, once like their ancestors were viewed as the religious threat. Fourth insight, I've kind of been applying this all along. We should listen for echoes in today's debates about being Muslim and American, for example. Today's fears about Muslims are eerily similar to those directed at Roman Catholics 175 years ago. Like Catholics 175 years ago, Muslims today welcome freedom to practice their religion. They wonder what to do with this freedom where it does not seem to fit Muslim thought and habits, just as Catholics did in the 1800s. Like other Americans, they worry that freedom might lead to moral and social disorder. Their desire for liberty and their concern about its consequences is American, and profoundly so. Protestant fears about Catholics reflected precisely such worries about religious freedom. History cannot tell us how recent Muslim immigrants will adapt to American life or how native-born Americans will adapt to them, but we can learn from these recurring fears of religious immigrants and similarly from recurring fears of immigrants on racial and ethnic grounds. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, raise your hand. And I think I'll start. You talked about 1880, we started with more federal rules about immigration. What was it like before that?
The short answer is there really wasn't any effective regulation of immigration. In the 1870s, there was a beginning with Chinese immigration, with Chinese women in 1875, and then Chinese in general in 1882. But there really was an absence of a federal bureaucracy. One of the things we maybe take for granted is that these things have always existed, so that policy changes. The story really is in the 1800s, policy emerging. And I tend to think, although I've not really researched this deeply, that the Civil War is in important ways part of it. The Civil War left a legacy of a much stronger federal government and a government that was much more bureaucratically active, in fighting the Civil War, in organizing the military, in organizing industry to produce all the weapons needs, and then a very active federal bureaucracy in reshaping the South in a process that was known as Reconstruction after the war. That new power of the federal government coincided with a time of globalization and the nationalization of the economy. So in general, it was an era when rules and regulations for different areas of economic life and social life were being written, and in some ways, immigration just naturally flows from that. And then there's one over there, Michael.
With the immigration laws that we have now that have been written over the last 200 years, is there any hope for making sense of them and having progress?
Well, so one of the things I didn't have time to talk about in the section on Muslims is that there have been bipartisan efforts a number of times in the last 30 years, especially during the Clinton, George Bush II, and Obama years. And those efforts usually tried to do two things: open up the flow of immigration to allow, especially in Mexico and Central America, so there'd be less illegal or undocumented and more legal immigration. And that's what the more people who want what they would view as progressive change were demanding. And then tightening up laws along the border to prevent illegal immigration. So increase the numbers, increase the power to regulate and limit the flow of illegal or undocumented immigrants. All of those efforts to really define new policy have failed, and they've failed more and more as the divide in American politics. So, if you think about it in terms of colors, there used to be a lot more purple politics where blue and red were mixing, and the percentage of people who are purplish has gotten thinner and thinner as the percentage of people who are red or blue, and strongly so, has increased. And similarly, unlike in the Bush years, when there was still a pretty good presence among Republicans for opening up to more immigration, whether for people from Mexico and Latin America or refugees, including Muslim refugees from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, that has thinned, and the people who are really strongly promoting simply build walls, literal and figurative, to prevent immigration. They've drowned out, the remaining moderates in the Republican Party. And then people in the Democratic Party who are concerned that all efforts to regulate immigration carry the danger of racism. So they're very suspicious and tend to oppose these efforts to develop bipartisan policies. They failed on both sides. I wouldn't say that should be taken to mean I'm necessarily favoring these moderate efforts. Look at the details, and I'm sure there's lots of things that one might not like. But what's really important is the bipartisan possibility. It was failing mostly in the 1990s and early 2000s, and we only seem further apart. So if you're looking for hope, I don't think there's much reason to be optimistic, at least. I'm always hopeful. That's rooted in faith. But when I look at the evidence, I have reason to be pessimistic. And the problem of refugees is only going to grow. The more climate change affects weather, and the weather starts to produce drought and the potential for famine in some places, the more sea levels rise and heavily populated coastal areas in places like Bangladesh and India, really in many parts of the world, make those places unlivable and make agriculture impossible, you're going to have more problems with refugees. And so I think the 21st century, the second half, is going to be one where refugees is a defining issue. So the pressure to deal with this problem is only going to grow.
Yeah. Will, you talked about different views of immigration and thinking about the United States as a melting pot.
Yep.
That was one more positive view. And then the cultural pluralism view. So you were talking about these in the context of what time period?
So those ideas, I talked about them in the context of debates over European immigration in the early 1900s. And so that's when those ideas begin to emerge. Interestingly, The Melting Pot is the name of a play that was written by a Jewish-British poet, not by an American, but he was writing about the United States. So that idea had in some ways been evolving for decades. What's really new in the early 20th century is this ideal of pluralism, that ethnic, racial, cultural, religious diversity are part of what make America great and good.
Yes, and then have you followed those views at all more into our time?
Yeah, those essential lines, that idea of there's a certain core of the nation that is the real Americans. And sometimes you'll hear about, we're having people from this part of the world foisted on us as Americans. Well, who are the implicit us as Americans there? So that reflects that kind of religious, racial, ethnic kind of sensibility about who real Americans are and who real Americans aren't. But you also still continue to have melting pot ideas. They may not use that phrase, but that's the idea that distinctive ethnic and cultural groups do, or at least should, disappear into this new thing, the American. And of course, you still have cultural pluralism ideals as well. So those emerged during the 20th century, and I would argue that in the mid to late 20th century, melting pot and pluralist ideas really won the argument and shaped the policy. And what's been happening in the last 20 years, is that debate reinvigorated again.
I think this will be our last question here.
Yeah, you indicated that the immigration from Europe petered out, dropped after the 1950s, and that was probably very much the impact, as you said, with the Marshall Plan. Given, that we helped the economic development in Europe, given that kind of picture, would it not also be wise that we would implement something like the Marshall Plan for, say, Central America, from which we have so many immigrants, refugees, who are dealing with not only economic but also corruption in those countries? If we were to have that kind of a wise policy that we had in the 1950s, that would be a major step to dealing with the problem that we have from that flow of thousands of people from Central America.
Yeah, and that's often argued. When people argue over why should we spend foreign development money, spend American tax dollars in other parts of the world, The argument that's usually made is that in the long run, peace and prosperity in other parts of the world decreases the likelihood of problems, whether those problems are in Asia, Africa, or the Middle East, or any other part of the world. And so, yeah, in fact, that's often been suggested that active efforts to promote economic development, to reduce corruption in government and policing in Central American countries, help to root out gangs and things like that, that would decrease the push factors that cause people to leave home, and would reduce the pressure here. Those debates are heavily criticized on a variety of grounds. From the nativist side, well, it's illegal, they shouldn't come, and we shouldn't have to help them. It's not our responsibility. And then sometimes from the progressive side, people saying, well, the motivation is racist. We don't want so many of them here, so that's why we're helping them. And so there's some suspicion there. I think, from my own point of view, especially if you take the climate change example, we need to stop thinking about these policies and thinking about strong distinctions between domestic and foreign, because that's simply not how the world works anymore. If you change the ecosystem here, you'll either create negative pressure and people will want to leave, or you'll create sort of a positive gravity and people will want to come. Foreign policies of whatever sort do the same thing. They have effects out there that affect us here. So it does seem to me that in the long run, whether it's the current version of refugee migrants from Central America, or whether it's a future of climate change migrants from many parts of the world, thinking holistically, globally, rather than simply locally will be important. It's also important to realize that climate change will also lead to refugees from really, really hot parts of the United States heading to places like Michigan. So you can imagine people from Michigan in a decade or two complaining about all these people from parts of the United States that have become hot and humid enough that they're unlivable. Now I've really scared you, right?
I want to thank you all for coming today and let you know our next lecture is going to be Monday, March 7th. It's going to be about Arthur Vandenberg, the man in the middle of the American century with Hank Meyer. He'll be here helping us with that. So that's Monday, March 7th, our next talk. And let's give another thanks to Professor Will Caterberg.
Thank you. And let me highly recommend this book. Originally, Amanda and I had been thinking of writing one book in the Calvin Short series. They're about 100 pages long, and we realized it was just unworkable. So we wrote two books. But she's got a great book. Mine and hers are both $10 on Amazon for paper, $5 for Kindle. I highly recommend her book. It's really good work. Thank you.